We are in chapter 18 of your United States history, and this chapter has to do with the age of industry, which is also called the Gilded Age, and we'll see that in chapter 19. So chapter 18 and chapter 19 are going to be on the same era or the same time period. So we start off with the age of industry, and the industry actually came from advances in agriculture and new machines, especially work machines when it came to agriculture, and then science aids. And so this is what we're going to go through, the age of industry. We're going to focus first on agriculture, because as the agriculture comes into a technology, so will the industry. So let's begin. The age of industry, the free enterprise. So what is free enterprise? Well, another name could be capitalism. Although free enterprise actually talks about freedom, because you're basically free to enterprise any business that you like, practically, huh? And capitalism is another name, and sometimes capitalism they use in a negative light. So I like to go by free enterprise. So the great industrial nation of the United States becomes this great industrial nation with abundant resources, people with character. Many have come to the Lord through the revivals at the time. The Puritan work ethic. Everyone worked together and liked to work. The economic system encouraged what is called individualism. So the free enterprise, the basic difference between free enterprise and communism and socialism is that free enterprise is based on the individual, and each individual has inalienable rights. And so, which we focus on, and God's focus is on the individuals too. As you go into socialism and communism, the individuals do not become so important anymore, do they? So during this period of time, there were very ingenious inventors because of free enterprise. People started inventing things. And a lot of hard-working businessmen and new technologies developed during this time. And the United States became the leading in the world in technology, even as is today. So here we have prosperity, free enterprise in America. New machines. Okay, we're focusing on agriculture right now. So let's think of these new machines. First of all, we have the plow sulky. What's a plow sulky? Well, it's where they could ride their plow instead of walking. A plow sulky, that they would be riding their plow. Before they had to push their plow, remember? And so now also they would develop what's called the gang plow, where they wouldn't just have one plow up one line, but they could do many lines at once. So they could plow up many lines to plant in at the same time. And this was the gang plow. Onto the spring-tooth harrow. Let's see if I have a picture of on there. I don't know if I have a picture of the spring-tooth harrow. But onto these planters and cultivators and hay mowers. The twine binder, here's a twine binder, which bound grain in bundles and put them in stacks. So you could have stacks of hay bundles. Twine binder, corn shellers, cream separators, all of these things. So let's go. I think this is the spring-tooth harrow. So these are all inventions for agriculture, for farming. And as the farmers would flourish, the nation would flourish at this time. So the McCormick Company. When you think of McCormick, always think of farming, because basically the McCormick Company became popular in selling and bringing in new equipment for the farmers. So in fact, the McCormick Company sold 152,000 binders in the year. So, and the combine, they also sold the combine, which reaped and threshed, at the same time in a continuous motion. So a combine would do two things. It reaped and it threshed the crops together. Picture of a combine. In the 1900s, the combine could produce 30 acres a day. So they could basically, instead of going through 30 acres would take quite a long time, maybe a month. Now they could produce 30 acres in one day. How quickly that would be, comparatively. And this replaced the mules and steam engines. Well, first of all, they used the mules, and then they used steam onto steam tractors and onto then gasoline and diesel, which replaced horses at that time. And increased in production and produced more crops to ship in large surpluses. And so now, not only did they produce enough crops for the towns and cities in the United States, but they also had surpluses that they could now send to foreign nations and supply foreign nations with food. Food and, I should say, other things like cotton too. You know, when I think of food, you think of, you know, they also had tea and tobacco and cotton and all, you know, any kind of agricultural and mostly food. When we think of corn and wheat and beans, right? So also science. Science aided agriculture too. There were better seeds and plants, and they developed these, and things became easier and better as they perfected these seeds and plants onto controlling pests. They had to control the pests, and we found a lot of times they put insecticides and stuff we find in the past, but still in finding some way they can control pests. And on to the soil fertility. They knew that crop rotation was very important at this time. So what's crop rotation? It would be planting different crops each year. So in especially the South, they abused the land by every year planting cotton until they wore out the land. And as they found out, if they put beans, soybeans especially, or peanuts and these kind of things in the midst, and planting in the midst of nitrogen types of plants, that they could actually, basically revitalize the soil. So crop rotation became very important, especially in the South. Contour plowing. They followed the curves of the earth, so this would eliminate soil erosion. See this picture of the curves of the earth? What you would find too, a lot of times with these curves, why would they do this? Is because erosion. Because the water would run straight down. If the water went straight down the hill, all of the topsoil, the good soil, would run down the hill too. So instead, they'd plant them in circular motions, where basically, and these circular motions would stop the water from eroding the earth. And new methods of irrigation of water. When they started to be able to irrigate certain lands, especially lands that were very arid and such, at this time they could grow even out in the desert areas when they could bring in water, because of course plants need water. Burbank and Carleton. Who are Burbank and Carleton? Well, you know they have to do with agriculture. Luther Burbank, he lived 1849 to 1926. And he basically put together new and better varieties of fruits and vegetables. So he's into agricultural science, right? He actually found a cactus that he called the thornless cactus in the midst of all this. And this thornless cactus that he actually bred, or I should say put together so that the cactus would not have thorns, you know, biologically. And he used this thornless cactus now for cattle feed. So it would grow in arid areas, that were dry areas, and be able to feed a lot of cows, a lot of cattle. He also put together a certain potato, a new variety of potato that was very, very sought after. And this potato was called the Burbank potato. Now let's talk about Mark Carleton here. This was Luther, here's Mark. Mark Carleton, he lived 1866 to 1925. And he was very into the development of different kinds of wheat. So he basically found in Russia, they had a variety of a wheat that needed very little rain. And so he could bring this wheat to America and plant it in very arid areas that did not get very much rain, and it would actually produce. And so bringing this Russian wheat in and having the farmers plant it instead worked very well, especially during drought seasons when they had little rain. Agriculture legislation at this time. So the development of agriculture, basically putting agriculture together, they did experiments on experimental farms and different types of plants and animals, conducting research on them so they could research the plant and animal diseases and find out which diseases and how to protect them from these diseases. And the new varieties of crops for certain soils. Certain soils had certain crops. So the different acts during this time of legislation. When you have the word acts, you think of law, you think of the government, right? So whenever you have act, this act was something the government put forth. We have the Morrill Act of 1862. The Morrill Act of 62 provided the land, basically provided land to specialize in agriculture with the colleges. Well, exactly bringing colleges that would specialize in agriculture, I should say. So Morrill Act had to do with study. You see its teacher here, 1862, it's Abraham Lincoln, and he's putting together colleges that would have to do with teaching agriculture, ag science. The Hatch Act of 1887 provided funds for state agriculture colleges. So one provided land, the Morrill provided the land for colleges to be built, and then the Hatch Act of 1888 provided funds for the colleges. So the colleges would get funding so that they could bring in students that would learn more about ag sciences, agriculture science, to research better farming methods, right? So here we have a picture here of the University of Maryland Agriculture, the experimental station here. See that? And the Morrill. So just remember, Morrill and Hatch both have to do with agriculture and putting together college funds to teach farmers and to teach young people to be farmers. Then there was the Smith-Lever Act of 1914. So in farming again, this was cooperative extension service in the Department of Agriculture to train young people in rural areas. So again, in rural areas, they wanted to put together this act so they could train young people. So the county agents who gave farmers advice, they did on-the-spot training. So they brought in these agents that knew all about farming and the new methods of farming and the new equipment to teach them on what the equipment of farming, and they brought in on-the-spot training. Here's a guy teaching a farmer on certain things and maybe on certain different crops to farm, who knows. But the Smith-Lever Act, again, in 1914, had to do with teaching education of farmers and especially young people to be farmers. Clubs at this time. You probably heard about these clubs, especially in the high schools even today. First of all was the 4-H, and this is, we're going 1914s, 1920s, that area. 4-H meant what? Head, heart, hands, and health, right? 4 H's. And this was the newest farming method, and also with homemaking. So they had 4-H, for both young men and young women, girls and boys. 4-H would start in 4-H. These are the clubs. In 1920, they also put together the FFA, Future Farmers of America, for boys to train in high schools for agriculture. So they bring in this. You have that in your area. We had that up in California, up at Bear River, and at Nevada Union. Of course, we have a lot of farmers out in the area that come from that area, bringing in to the fair all their animals, right? You know all about that. But anyway, FFA, that's where it started, 1920s. And then there was FHA, Future Homemakers of America, for girls. So FFA in the beginning was just for boys, and FHA was homemakers for girls, but now they're kind of mixed together. So here we have, 4-H and FFA. George Washington Carver. Now, if you need to know about him, I would like to, investigate his life more because he was quite an amazing individual. He lived 1864 to 1943, and he was one of the greatest contributors to American agriculture. He was born into slavery in 1864, right after the Civil War, right? He was born into slavery, but then of course he became a freedman very young. And so he remained with his former owner. And his former owner, he was just a young boy then, basically it was actually the mother who taught him how to read and write. So coming from a former slave owning community, you have this wife of the former owner teaching him to read and write, which was pretty amazing. And then sent him to the freedmen's school. So he went to a freedmen's school for those slaves that had been set free to go to school. In 1890, he went to Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa. So he was actually from Iowa, George Washington Carver. He worked several jobs to pay for the education. That's exactly, when I say Iowa like that, it's because that's where I was born, in Sioux City, Iowa. And he is actually, an Iowan. So he worked several jobs to pay for his education, of course, because he had to pay for it. So he worked. And then he went to Iowa State College, Iowa State Agricultural College in Ames, Iowa. And he graduated there in 1894. He was so bright, so intelligent, that he became the assistant botanist at the college. So he became actually onto one of the top botanists at the college. Here's a picture of him, George Washington Carver. Let's go on. Professor Carver and Booker T. Washington. Sometimes you get those guys mixed up because they both have the Washington in their name. But here we have Booker T. Washington and we have George Washington Carver, right? So in 1896, Carver met with Booker T, right? They met each other. So if you recall in the past videos, I talked about Booker T, and Booker T had what was called the Tuskegee Institute. And that's where the Tuskegee Institute, they bring in these freedmen, we bring in a lot of black former slaves and young people, and where they could dedicate the rest of their life in the midst to train Black American students, not only there. So this is a place of training. And this is what Professor Carver decided. He went from Ames, Iowa, down to Tuskegee Institute, where he joined with Booker T, and the rest of his life he was dedicated to training Black American students. And then this extended the fame because Professor Carver was so bright and was such a scientist that the whole world looked onto whatever he did. Because his research with the peanut and the sweet potato and soybeans became phenomenal, I'm telling you. He actually saved the South because the South, again, had been depleted. The soil had been so depleted that it was overworked, that they needed to get more land. So he's the one basically said, well, let's plant some beans, let's plant some other crops to put nitrogen back into the soil. And so the soil will be replenished. So he actually saved the South. And if you go back, I'd love to do more on him because he developed 300 and more uses for the peanut. And I think about, I don't know how many hundreds of uses for the sweet potato and beans. So can you think, before this time, the peanut, they only fed peanuts to pigs. They thought the peanut was totally useless and no good. And so he took the peanut in the midst of this, using the peanut to replenish the lands, but also found 300 uses for the peanut. And I always think of peanut butter, huh? So how important the peanut became in the South then. So this goes on to the agriculture. And The Christianity and Professor Carver, he was a devout, born-again Christian. He loved the Bible and he lived according to the principles of the Bible. He taught Sunday school with students and he called his laboratory. He had a laboratory. You know what he called his laboratory? God's little workshop. He believed that God brought him wisdom in his little workshop. And God also brought him to international fame as everyone in the world called him the Peanut Man, even in other countries. But he led this quiet and modest life as a humble servant of God, and he was an example to all, especially to the Black American culture. One of the things he wrote here, he says, I love to think of nature as unlimited broadcasting stations through which God speaks to us every day, every hour, and every moment of our lives. If we will only tune in and remain so. So what he said, he goes, hey, you guys, you need to tune into God, and God will broadcast wisdom to you. How amazing. I really love Professor Carver in his foundation in Christianity. A great man of God and a hero to American agriculture.